So now that Thanksgiving is past, it's gonna start getting cold outside. You know it's gonna snow pretty soon. That's why this week, we're gonna make a very easy and delicious pot roast. Now I like to use chuck because chuck has a lot of fat and protein and it's super, super tender. It's gonna be the perfect meal to eat on a nice cold day. Make sure you guys like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's get to cooking. Now to start this off, we have a 3 or 4 pound chuck roast. This came from a steer me and my wife got about a year ago. It was vacuum sealed, I just thawed it out. Keep in mind though, anytime you do a roast, a brisket, anything like that, it's gonna shrink by about half. So if you start about 3 or 4 pounds, it's gonna shrink down to about 2 pounds. We're gonna keep it real simple. We're gonna season this generously with salt. Make sure you get it all over. Don't be afraid to salt it. And black pepper. Make sure we get the other side. Nice little generous, big pinches of salt, black pepper. This is 18 mesh coarse ground black pepper, and I'm using some kosher salt. Go ahead and mop up the sides here. All right, so we're gonna let this hang out here while we get the pot nice and hot, and we're gonna give this a nice sear. So what I have here is a Dutch oven. It's probably around 7 or 8 quarts. Now I like to make a roast in a Dutch oven because these are very versatile. You can deep fry in these. They can go in the oven. You can keep them on the stove. We're gonna place this on medium heat. And we're gonna add a little bit of avocado oil. The reason I like to use avocado oil, it's perceived healthier than a vegetable oil. Also has a high smoke point. So if you use something like olive oil has a low smoke point, and it's really not good to be searing meat and stuff like that. So if you don't have an avocado oil, you could just use a vegetable oil, but keep in mind though, it's not the healthiest of oils. Now we're just gonna heat this up on medium heat until the oil starts to shimmer, then we're gonna sear our chuck roast. Now that the oil is hot, we're gonna go ahead and carefully add in our chuck roast. Go ahead and press down a little bit so it makes contact. This has been searing for about 3 minutes or so on this side. We're gonna go ahead and give it a flip and take a look. See how we're doing? And as you can see, we have a beautiful sear on this side. We're gonna let it go for about another 3 minutes on this side. All right, so now that we have a good sear on that side, we're gonna go ahead and just get these sides real quick. Don't forget them. They don't need to go as long as front and back. We're just gonna get a little bit of color on them. Another 30 seconds or a minute on each side. You can always lean it up against the side of the pot if you don't wanna hold it. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and remove this from the pot, set it aside right over here. Now what we have here is all that beautiful fond that's gonna give a ton of flavor. That's why you sear the meat. You get a good Maillard reaction, you get that fond, and it just makes your stew or your roast just taste absolutely amazing. Now we're gonna go ahead and add a sliced onion. Season the onion with a little bit of salt to draw out some of the moisture. See now, as the onions release that moisture, it's gonna release that fond on the bottom of the pot, so you can get all that nice flavor into the actual roast. Also at this point, you wanna go ahead and turn down the heat to medium-low, medium, just so you don't burn this fond on the bottom. Now once these onions get some nice color and they start to turn translucent, just like this, we're gonna add 3 ribs of diced celery and a few carrots. We're gonna let this continue to cook for just a few minutes, probably around 5 or so minutes. We're gonna make a little hole right in the center so that we see the bottom of the pot. Now I like to add about 1 to 2 tablespoons of tomato paste. This adds a lot of richness, a good tomato flavor to your pot roast. We're gonna add just a touch more oil right on top of that tomato paste. Now we want this to make contact with the bottom of the pot and caramelize slightly. It's gonna bring out that flavor. A lot of people don't do this. They don't let it caramelize. It just brings out a whole nother dimension of flavor. Now after you start to see this tomato paste start to simmer, see how it's getting stuck to the bottom? That's what you want. You want it to caramelize just like that. Now we're gonna add about 5 cloves of minced garlic. Go ahead and give this a stir into all the vegetables and the tomato paste. And you'll start to smell the garlic after about 30 seconds to a minute. And as soon as you smell the garlic, we're gonna add a few tablespoons of flour. This is gonna go ahead and thicken up the gravy. You wanna let that flour cook for a few minutes here just to get out that taste. But also keep in mind, since this roast is gonna cook for around 3 to 4 hours, it's not gonna taste like flour. Now if you're gluten-free, you can always use gluten-free flour, or you can use a little bit of cornstarch later on or arrowroot to thicken it up. Now at this point, we're gonna add a few cups of a dry red wine. About 2 cups or so. Now if you can't have alcohol, that's fine. You can always just use a little bit of beef stock. Just leave out the wine and just add extra beef stock at this point, just to get that flour to kind of mix in with the vegetables a little more, get all this stuff to stop sticking from the bottom of the pot. Now we're gonna go in with about 4 cups of beef stock. If we need more beef stock, we can always add some a little bit later on once we actually add the roast to this pot. Once we add the roast, we want the stock to go up about halfway to the roast. We don't want it to be too shallow on the roast because we want it to cook evenly. Now we're gonna add a nice big sprig of some fresh thyme. I love thyme, it's one of my favorite herbs. And then a couple bay leaves. Now I know this is most likely gonna need some more salt and pepper, so I'm gonna add a big pinch of salt and black pepper now. And then once it's done, we can always taste it and adjust the seasoning to our liking later on. We're gonna give this one final stir here. Now we're gonna go ahead and add our roast right to the pot, kind of nestle it down in there. And that was the perfect amount of beef stock, as you can see. Now what we're gonna do here, I'm gonna nestle in some potatoes, as many of that as I can get to fit. These are just some russet potatoes that I cut into quarters. Now I like to have the skin on because this is gonna cook for a few hours. If you cut these potatoes without the skin, they're gonna disintegrate into basically nothing. You're gonna have mashed potatoes inside of your roast. So make sure you leave the skin on anytime you're adding potatoes to the roast. Now if you're gonna do this with mashed potatoes, obviously don't add any potatoes. You'll just mash these potatoes up later. But for this recipe, I'm actually just gonna add the potatoes now, and we're gonna eat them along with the roast. Go ahead and nestle these down in here. All right, so now what we're gonna do, we're gonna cover this with the lid, and we're gonna place this in the oven set to about 325 degrees Fahrenheit for probably around 2.5, 3 hours. It might take 4, but I'm gonna check it after about 2.5 hours, and we're gonna see if this roast is done. All right, so this has been cooking for about 3 or 4 hours now. And as you can see, if I use a butter knife here, it's probe tender. Look at that. It's going right in like butter, all the way down. That's how you know it's done. So we had this on about 325 the whole time. After about an hour and a half, I gave it a flip and cooked it for another hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer. And as you can see, it's nice and probe tender. Now let's go ahead and serve this up. So we're gonna add some of the veggies right to the bottom of the bowl here. Now, luckily I added enough flour so we don't have to thicken up the gravy. But if it was a little too thin, what you wanna do is put this on the stove and you wanna let it simmer very gently, and then you're gonna thicken it with a little bit of cornstarch. We're gonna tear off a nice little hunk of meat here, add it right to the middle, add a little more gravy right on top. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna garnish with a little bit of green onion, just to give that fresh onion flavor, and some freshly chopped parsley. And there you have it, that's our beautiful roast. Let's go ahead and give it a try. You know, there's not many dishes I crave this time of year, but this is definitely one of them. The beef is super, super tender, and partly it's because we use chuck roast, and the fat content that's in the chuck makes it super tender. Our gravy is perfectly thick, just the way I want it. The potatoes thicken it up a little bit, as well as that flour. Now, if you're gonna serve this over mashed potatoes, you might have to thicken it with a little bit of cornstarch because you won't have the extra potatoes inside the gravy. It does need a tad bit more salt, but remember, you can always add more salt. It's harder to take it away. So just a little bit of sprinkle of salt will bring all those flavors together. Our potatoes, because we left the skin on, they didn't fall apart. The carrots are cooked perfectly. I will say this though, I've never put green onion on top of a roast before, but I will say I like it a lot. It adds a nice freshness to the dish, so I definitely recommend doing that. If you guys give it a try, please leave me a comment. And if you enjoyed this video or you learned something, give me a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.